This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zachariason.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zachariason, and this is episode 679 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. Week 1 was good. Week 2, not so good. It was a rough sleeper show last week. I'll be the first one to admit it. Carson Wentz and Jahan Dotson were fine. Gerald Everett was good. Josh Palmer saved his day with a touchdown. Greg Dortch was good too. So not everything was terrible. But some of the misses were pretty big misses. The entire Colts offense was complete trash. Zach Moss didn't get the garbage time work that I thought that he might get. MVS still stunk it up despite his route participation. DJ Chark was a goose egg. I've seen better days. But I want to recap things each week to really look back and hold myself accountable. So let's be better here in week 3. Before getting to the sleepers this week, I wanted to let you know that Twisted Tea and FanDuel have joined forces to bring you a one-of-a-kind contest series that gives you a chance to compete for your share of thousands of dollars in site credit. Introducing Twisted Tea's College Football Picks, a sports betting-focused contest series that's entirely free to play. The contest is simple. Each college football game will be assigned money line, spread, and total markets with assigned points to each market. All you have to do is make 6 selections based on those 3 markets and earn points for each correct selection you made. If at the end of the day your score ranks among the best in the contest, you'll be eligible for your share of site credit. Head over to FanDuel.com/TwistedTeaPicks and make your picks. And remember, please drink responsibly. The first tier on this sleeper show each week consists of players who are rostered in 25 to 50% of Yahoo leagues. And in this tier is Jared Goff, my top streaming option this week. The Detroit-Minnesota game has the highest game total of the week. The over-under is set at 53.5 over on FanDuel Sportsbook. So that's the first reason that he's an attractive option. Now we know Amon-Ra St. Brown has been completely crushing it to start this year. And he's played about 75% of his snaps from the slot. Minnesota's allowed the 8th most receiving yards to the slot so far this year, so that's a good sign too. This game's being played in a dome and has real shootout potential. So Goff makes plenty of sense. He's a high-end QB2 for me this week. Jakobi Meyers is still rostered in fewer than 50% of Yahoo leagues, and if you need a high floor option, I think he's definitely in play. He's sitting at a 29.7% target share on the season after seeing 38% of New England's targets this past Sunday against Pittsburgh. Now, the Steelers have traditionally been bad against slot guys during the Tomlin era, but Meyers is likely going to see a high target share in this offense just in general. He had a 24% target share last year. Pro Football Focus has Meyers at about a 62% slot snap share so far this season. That's close to where he was a season ago. After last week, Baltimore now ranks 2nd in the NFL in slot yards allowed, and they're 1st in slot receptions allowed. That's obviously skewed a little bit, but it can't hurt the Meyers argument. I doubt the ceiling is insane, but in PPR formats, Meyers is flex-worthy. Treylon Burks is still rostered in fewer than 50% of Yahoo leagues as well. If he's on your waiver wire, you should add him right away, because the arrow is pointing up. In week 1, Burks saw 16% of Tennessee's targets. He ran a route on just 38% of Ryan Tannehill's dropbacks. In week 2, that target share shot up to almost 29%. His route participation jumped to 63%. Here are the current players with 10 or more targets across the league right now and a yards per route run rate at or above 3.4. You ready for this? Stephon Diggs, Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle, Rashad Bateman, Treylon Burks. The Titans aren't facing the Bills this week. They get the Raiders. That's a much better matchup on paper. Burks is a really interesting player in week 3, and I think he's someone that you should be buying in general in fantasy football. Not that this is a 15 transactions episode or anything. Robbie Anderson is still available in a lot of leagues despite having a higher expected fantasy points total than DJ Moore through 2 games. And despite having a 32% target share game and then an 18.5% target share game last week. It's not that the matchup is unreal against the Saints. I'd actually call it a tough one. But volume is what we're asking for in fantasy football. I at least think Anderson's a top 50 wide receiver this week. And then I've got 2 tight end streamers from this tier as well. One is Logan Thomas. I'm not jumping for joy for Logan Thomas like some across the industry are right now, because his peripherals aren't spectacular. He has about a 13% target share through 2 games, and he actually ranks pretty low in route participation. But he's also coming off that ACL injury from last year, so it's a positive sign overall that he's at least been productive. And he gets the Eagles this week. Washington could be playing from behind in this game, and the Eagles have been pretty average at defending tight ends to start the year. So I think that Thomas could work. But to be honest, I like Evan Ingram more. I talked about Ingram on the 15 transactions episode this week. I won't get into the fact that he's basically a top 10 to top 15 tight end usage-wise to start the year. Like Thomas, Ingram's offense will probably be playing in a negative game script as big underdogs of the Chargers. Unlike Thomas, Ingram ranks 8th in route participation at the tight end position. He's been involved in his offense, and he has a shot to come through with a decent streaming game in week 3. Now, this next tier consists of players rostered in 11 to 25% of Yahoo leagues, and I've got yet another quarterback streamer for you. His name is Marcus Mariota, and he likes to run. The Seahawks have been pretty average at giving up fantasy points to quarterbacks this year. That's who Marcus Mariota is facing. But they face the Broncos and the 49ers. Technically, when you adjust for how those teams then did in their other games, Seattle's a top 5 matchup for quarterbacks. Now, the sample size is too small to work off of that, but I did want to at least throw that out there. The reason Mariota works is rushing. He's currently averaging 44 rushing yards per game. That's essentially an additional touchdown pass. He's only trailing Lamar Jackson and Jalen Hurts in rushing yards at the quarterback position. This game against Seattle is probably not going to be very fun. There's probably not going to be a ton of offense. But I do think Mariota is a mid-range QB2 this week, making him streamer-worthy. Josh Palmer is around the 25% rostered mark, though by the end of this episode and by the time that it's out there, maybe that number's a little bit higher. Regardless, I do think that he works this week, especially if Keenan Allen is out again. At this moment, that has not been confirmed. But even though Palmer was bailed out by a late-game touchdown in week 2, he saw 8 targets and accounted for a 17% target share in that Chargers offense. In that offense, that's totally fine. He also clearly played as the team's number 2 wide receiver. He actually led all Chargers wide receivers in snaps last week. He ran a route on nearly every single one of Justin Herbert's dropbacks. Now he gets a decent matchup against the Jags, and the Chargers have a team total above 27 points. Even if Keenan Allen goes, he might not be 100%. So Palmer does work. Now, I talked about Sterling Shepard on the 15 transactions show, and I think he's a decent enough flex type option this week. I mean, ideally you'd have a better option, but Shepard isn't a terrible play. He's seen the best target share on the Giants this year at 26.4%, and he's really doing that all over the field. He's seeing looks everywhere. Richie James has taken on the most slot snaps for the Giants this season. Shepard second. Just follow the volume. Shepard hasn't come through with a monster game yet this year, but the peripherals are there. And then lastly in this tier is J.D. McKissic. Week 1 was pretty neutral in terms of script for Washington, and then we saw a slightly different game environment in week 2, which allowed McKissic to find the field more. That turned into McKissic running routes at a higher rate in week 2 than he did in week 1, and he saw a 15.9% target share last week. That was more than double his week 1 target share. That's what's going to happen in more negative game scripts for Washington. Week 3 is a game against Philadelphia, which could be a big negative game script for Washington. And that's basically what you have to bank on when you're talking about running back sleepers. You have to bank on game script. All non-game script dependent running backs are already rostered in fantasy football. So anyone using J.D. McKissic are just hoping that this game gets out of hand, that he just gets a lot of garbage time targets. If this game goes south for Washington, that will benefit J.D. McKissic. Now we're into players rostered in fewer than 10% of Yahoo leagues. This is where you got to hold on to your pants, because some of these picks are wild each week. And let's start with a wild one, Mac Hollins. Hunter Renfro's dealing with a concussion. There's a chance that we don't see him in the slot this weekend for Vegas. He missed practice on Wednesday. That alone could shift targets to other players in the offense. But Mac Hollins had a 20.5% target share this past week. And the Titans have been a team that hasn't really been targeted in the slot this year. They rank 31st in percentage of targets that have gone to that area of the field, meaning teams are beating them more on the perimeter. That's where Mac Hollins plays. On the season, Hollins has played almost just as much as Davante Adams. He's run just 5 fewer routes. So I think he does make sense as a very deep sleeper this week. I'm talking deep. Now, with all the injuries to Buccaneers wide receivers, you could look to Brashad Perriman. I'd expect him to get some run with this Mike Evans suspension, and I'm expecting Chris Godwin to not suit up again this week. And even at this moment, I'm not totally sure if Julio Jones is going to play. But regardless, even though the matchup could be tough at times depending on where Jair Alexander lines up, Perriman was second on the team in wide receiver routes run last week. We know he's got the ability to make a big play or two. And that's really what you're crossing your fingers for when it comes to these types of players. Russell Gage is a safer option for sure on that team coming out of the slot, but Perriman does make some sense too. Now, I talked about Ashton Dulin on the 15 Transactions episode, and I want to bring him up here too. Michael Pittman and Alec Pierce could be back this week, but I still believe that Ashton Dulin could end up becoming the team's number 2 wide receiver this year. Even if he doesn't play as the clear 2 this week, the Colts get the Chiefs. They could be running a lot of 3 wide receiver sets because they're going to fall behind in that game. Last week, 3 Colts wide receivers, Paris Campbell, Dulin, and Michael Strawn, ran a similar number of routes in a situation like that where they were trailing. Dulin's just been effective, and when he's on the field, he's getting targeted. Among all players with 10 or more targets this year, he's tied with Kyle Phillips for the league lead in targets per route run. Maybe Dulin doesn't come through this week, but I do think it's possible he has another solid game. And then lastly in this tier, Juwan Johnson. He's still rostered in just 1% of Yahoo leagues. Johnson is one of 15 tight ends averaging a 16% target share per game so far this year, and he's in the top 15 in route participation as well. He's the Saints tight end 1. He's playing as the tight end 1. So he can be a dart throw tight end if someone like Evan Ingram isn't available for you this week. Now, before I let you go, I want to throw out some defensive streamers that you could play here in week 3. There's actually a good number of them this week, so I'm going to do this more in rapid fire fashion. The Giants were the 15 Transactions pick because they're home favorites and they're facing Cooper Rush. But I think you could go play Seattle, who's at home against Atlanta. And you could even use the Falcons if you're in a pinch. And then there's another matchup where you could do the exact same thing, and that's Chicago and Houston. You could play the Bears defense. I like the Bears defense more than the Texans defense, but you could even play the Texans defense too. So there's 5 right there. I think the Giants are the most intriguing, but there's a lot of variance with defense. So I do think that any of those defenses work this week. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Remember to go check out LateRound.com and click Patreon and join the Patreon. There's rest of season rankings, weekly rankings, an awesome Discord community, and more. So check it out, LateRound.com. Thanks for listening, everyone. I will talk to you tomorrow with the last episode of the week, the mailbag episode.